go. Record is on. Admit. Alrighty, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining Black Professionals.
Positive thinking works wonders. We got the king on our side. We got long arrested.
Make sure I mute. If everyone can mute themselves, please. But let me see if I can. Oh, here we go. Mute on entry. That's what I need to do. Perfect. And just make sure that Miss Naima can unmute herself.
I'm unmuted.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. So that should be set. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Black Professionals in International Affairs today as a part of our leadership speaking series. My name is Alexandria Maloney, and I'm a BPIA board member and your moderator for today. So we're excited to speak with our guest speaker. The thoughts and views of our speakers are their own. And if you haven't already, please follow Black Professionals in International Affairs on our social media platforms. And lastly, as we begin to have this conversation, we encourage listeners to chime in the chat box with any comments or questions that they may have. So without further ado, I will introduce our guest speaker. Ms. Naima Green-Riley is a Ph.D. candidate and Raymond Vernon Fellow in the Department of Government at Harvard University. Her dissertation research focuses on U.S. and Chinese public diplomacy, merging theoretical work from the fields of political science, communications, and psychology. Naima's academic work intersects with her contributions to global development and diplomacy. She is a member of the board of the directors of Oxfam America. Before pursuing her PhD, Naima was a Pickering Fellow and a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State, where she worked in the public diplomacy cone. Naima was the Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Alexandria, Egypt, during the Arab Spring between 2011 and 2013, and she also served as a Consular Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Guangzhou, China during the Obama administration's pivot to Asia from 2014 to 2015. So Ms. Naima, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Of course, happy to. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, so could you start off by sharing a little bit about how the COVID-19 situation may be affecting your time right now as a PhD candidate, or, you know, for you and your peers in that field?
Sure. You know, before we started, we were talking a little bit, and I was saying, it's strange how you go into the work of international relations, and I started as a diplomat, and you have a very sort of a public life, you're always meeting with people. But when you pursue an academic track, when I went into the PhD program, I realized that a lot of my work, a lot of my time is spent by myself. And being the most productive sometimes means being the most aloof, not really engaging with people, because I'm sitting in front of a computer, I'm writing dissertation chapters, I'm trying to get an article out, all of this stuff. And so COVID-19 has made it so that I have lots of time to do those things. And yet I've noticed, and I think that this is a key point for everyone on the call probably, I've noticed that just because I have all the time in the world to do my work doesn't mean that I should be using all the time that I have to do my work, because it really can be, you know, like, can be difficult to stay motivated and to produce good stuff when I'm always working. So I've been sitting in front of a computer screen for a while. Now I have my phone screen, so it's at least a smaller screen that I can look at right now. But it's been a lot of sort of staying in the house just like everybody else.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. So I'd like to start the conversation by, you know, having your reflections and experience during your time as a Foreign Service Officer. So could you share your journey into that career field with us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I started out with my career at the State Department as a Pickering Fellow. And I think that the Pickering and Ringle fellowships are some of the most valuable programs that the State Department has. If anyone has not heard of them, these are two programs that were created in order to diversify the foreign service at the State Department, to make sure that instead of having the old striped pants boys who were all, you know, one pedigree, one race, one gender making up the foreign service. We were seeing, you know, the people that make up the diverse United States population representing the US abroad at embassies and consulates. And so when I was in undergrad, the Pickering Fellowship had two different specific fellowships, one for undergrads and one for graduate students. And now I believe there's only one fellowship and it's for graduate students. So I actually applied for the Pickering when I was like 19 years old. I was a sophomore in college. I didn't think I was going to get it, but I thought, how cool would it be if I got a scholarship to help pay for college and grad school, and then I could join the Foreign Service, which would be a dream job anyway. And it did work out. And so after I finished my undergrad at Stanford, and then I went to Harvard to get a master's in public policy, I started in A100, which is the entry-level course for all foreign service officers, in the fall of 2010. And then I spent 5 years in the Foreign Service. And during that time, I was able to serve in both Alexandria, Egypt as a public affairs officer. So I was doing public diplomacy work, which was what I was hired to do, my cone of focus. And then in my second job, I did consular work in China. And I found it to be such a fantastic, both personal and professional experience to be at the State Department. So I always say to folks who are considering an international career to really look at the Foreign Service. It's a career, you know, it provides you with not just one job, but the potential for a series of really interesting jobs in different parts of the world. And so I really enjoyed it a lot. Also, personally, you know, I was living in a foreign country where for the weekend, instead of, you know, like going down the street, I could, you know, I could go to the Mediterranean, or I could take trips to different parts of the world. And because I had, you know, like the comfortable lifestyle that I did, I was able to do all those things at a really young age, which was a real blessing for me. And so I think it was formative for me in terms of helping me to understand international affairs, how I might be involved in the future in national security, and also to find regional and functional areas of focus that were really of the most interest to me.
Great, thank you for that. So could you tell us
Did I
more?
answer your question? Is there more I can add?
Yeah, no, no, that was great. That was great. Could you tell us more about what a typical day in the life of a Foreign Service officer looks like and what that experience was like for you?
Yes, and I can also recommend a book. I'm big into books now because I study them and I'm writing one. Dissertation is always the first draft of a book. So I'll start with a recommendation of a book. It's called Inside a U.S. Embassy, and it actually has chapters that go through sort of narratives of people who are diplomats who are living in different places and working. And so I recommend that book for people who would really want to get sort of a bird's eye view into what the day-to-day is like. And the reason is that every single job in the Foreign Service is so different. So just as a basic overview, you know, the Foreign Service has 5 career tracks, 5 cones, they call it. And depending on your career track, you might spend the majority of your career doing different types of jobs. And so the 5 different areas are political, economic, public diplomacy, management, and consular. And, you know, political officers are mostly responsible for keeping tabs on the political situations, political developments in the countries to which they're assigned, and writing cables back to Washington, D.C., to the State Department, so that the government can stay abreast of what's happening locally on a day-to-day basis in different countries. Economic officers do something similar, but they really pay attention to economic trends, economic events in different countries. Public diplomacy officers, which is the cone that I was, are responsible for managing the people-to-people and also government-to-people relations in certain countries. And so while many people think of diplomacy as an elite field, my day-to-day when I was in Egypt involved going to universities or schools or professional syndicates and bringing American speakers with me to talk about their specialties. It involved really fun stuff like hosting huge concerts at major venues, and really interesting work with small groups of people who were maybe wanted to learn more about what their particular area of focus, for example, lawyers or doctors or groups of academics who wanted to have conversation and to have sort of dialogue with Americans who were in that field. It also looks at sort of exchanges, so things like the Fulbright and a number of exchanges that are country to country. That's what public diplomacy officers do as well. Consular officers manage the American services of an embassy, but they also are responsible for all of the visas that are issued abroad. And management officers make sure that everything keeps running in embassies around the world, because these are major operations in places where there are large embassies like Iraq or Cairo, or China. You know, there are hundreds of Americans who are flown out by the government and then housed by the government in local apartment buildings, and then provided with things like shuttles to work, and making sure that they have a solid internet connection, and also making sure that the embassy itself is running and has all the support that it needs. And so that takes an entire rank of people who are management officers in the Foreign Service, who go from post to post and make sure those things happen on a day-to-day basis. I would say that my life when I was in Egypt and then my life when I was in China was drastically different. So I mentioned that in Egypt, I was doing a lot of going out and meeting with people. I was doing a lot of hosting of events. I was nominating people to go on 2-week to 1 year scholarship or exchange programs to the United States. When I was in China, I was standing behind a visa window for most of the day, and interviewing people I was interviewing people in Mandarin usually, but sometimes when they didn't speak Mandarin, we would have another translator who could speak dialects about why they wanted to go to the United States. So really different experience, because I wasn't getting out, but the range of people that I was able to see through that experience was so great. You had everyone from like the famous, scientists or cellists who needed to go to the United States for a business conference, to the woman who was a farmer from like some tiny town in rural China, whose son is getting a PhD at Berkeley and who wants to go to their graduation. And so it's really just cool to see the range of what the Chinese citizenry looks like, especially given that, U.S.-China relations are kind of strained. So it's not like there are a lot of opportunities to really understand what different types of Chinese people are like as those tensions rise in the current atmosphere.
Thank you for sharing that. What would you say that you liked the most about your work as an FSO, and then what was the most challenging parts of being an officer?
I think the thing that I liked the most about the job was my ability to always feel like I was in, and perhaps this is particularly because of my jobs, but I really felt like I was in the mix. I felt like I was right in the middle of some of the most important bilateral relationships that the United States had. Part of that was by chance, I should say, because not every place is always sort of like at the center of international affairs. But when I went to Egypt, I was assigned to go there in my entry-level class in November 2010. And I was excited about going to Egypt because I had grown up there. My father is a professor, and he taught at the American University in Cairo when I was a child. And so I thought, Egypt would be a really interesting place to go back and work, because I spent so much of my time, I spent 6 years of my childhood living there. And so that was the reason I wanted to go to Egypt. But got the assignment in 2010, was supposed to arrive in April 2011. And then in January 2011, the Arab Spring begins, and Egypt is catapulted into like a major place in terms of US foreign policy. Right. And so I it was just fascinating to sort of see that country change so rapidly. And it was really, really cool to see the United States at a point where we were able to, you know, uh, have a say into what the future of that country might be. I remember a couple months after the revolution, President Obama gave a speech at the State Department, and I was still in Washington, so I was sitting there watching the President of the United States talk about, you know, how the Arab Spring had changed the Middle East and how the U.S. is going to have to adapt to the future, and thinking, oh my goodness, in 1 month I'll be there, and I'll be able to see for myself all these changes taking place and represent this abroad. Then in terms of the experience in the things that were most difficult, I think the thing that was the most difficult, well, I have two. On the one hand, I did feel sometimes like things were a little bit uncertain. And so when Benghazi happened and I was stationed in Egypt, the same day that Benghazi happened, protesters scaled the wall of the embassy in Cairo and ripped down the American flag. And there were widespread protests across the Middle East. It was what was called the Day of Rage. So the U.S. isn't always loved in every part of the world, and definitely we have a complex relationship with many countries in the Middle East, and that was very, very apparent and very palpable sometimes. And so there were times when I just felt a little bit uncertain about what might happen next. But that type of an uncertainty, I would say, never rose to a point. Sorry, I'm outside, so you'll hear a dog. Not my dog. It never rose to the point where I was actually physically afraid for my life. You know, it was just more of like an uncertainty about how day to day would unfold. Kind of like the pandemic has inserted a healthy amount of uncertainty into all of our lives. And then the other thing that was difficult, I think, was just being far away from home. I had friends who were getting married, to fly from China to the United States, even though I think I ended up flying back like for at least 2 weddings when I was in China, because I just felt like I couldn't miss them. There were a lot of things that I missed, and that was hard.
Thank you so much for sharing. I see we have a few new folks who have joined on the call, so I just wanted to say hello and welcome to everyone. And to please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments in the Zoom group chat if you have any. So up next, I'm going to transition the conversation around the topic of this discussion, which is academia and foreign policy. So could you share a little bit about what does that intersection look like, and where did that interest, what sparked your interest in taking this direction?
Sure, I am happy to. Well, I mentioned a little earlier that my dad is a professor. Mm-hmm. He was, you know, the first person in his family to go and get a Ph.D. It's not like he came from this sort of like long line of academics. But I think he and my mother both raised us with like a very healthy respect for and desire to invest in our education. And so when I was little, my dad, you know, some people condition their children by saying, you know, you're going to college, one day you're going to college, blah, blah, blah. My dad would tell us as kids, when you go get your PhD, this is how it's going to be. So I didn't understand that wasn't something that everyone wasn't told to do from a very young age. So I think he, you know, put in my head from very young that this is something that was a good thing to do, something that could be useful. And I guess that never really went away. So when I went into the State Department, as I mentioned, this is a career. This is something that's a long-term endeavor. And I really enjoyed it. But at the same time, I thought, I'm supposed to get this PhD. How am I going to get it? So when I applied to PhD programs, I actually tried to stay in the Foreign Service. And at the time, the career was pretty rigid. From what I hear now, there's a little bit more flexibility from the State Department in terms of taking leave. Although the PhD is so long-term that it still might be difficult for someone to become a Foreign Service officer and actually stay in the Foreign Service and then also get a PhD. So I left the Foreign Service a little bit grudgingly because I really did enjoy it and I wanted to stay to get this PhD, because once I got in, I wasn't going to say no. And that has been, it's been an entirely new process of learning, and not just like the classroom learning of a PhD. You have 2 years of classwork in a PhD, and the rest is really focused on doing research and trying to write a good dissertation. But it's been a process of really understanding how policy intersects with theorizing and writing on international relations, and then also learning a lot about how there's a lot of misfiring and a lot of distance between the two fields, more than I had expected to see. And so I definitely haven't figured it all out, but I have learned that navigating a career in which one can engage in policy and navigating a career in which one is focused on academia, are two separate endeavors, and to combine them is tricky.
Could you tell us a little more about your research focus area?
Sure. I study public diplomacy, which is something that I used to do. And the reason that I study public diplomacy is because I noticed that a lot of people tend to write about the political dynamics related to diplomacy. A lot of people tend to focus on international political economy or economic relationships. And yet, when I read books in political science, I rarely see work that is on the people to government or government to people relationships that that ultimately have impact on bilateral or multilateral or international relationships. And so that doesn't mean there's no work done on this. A lot of people point to the soft power concept. So Joseph Nye, he's a Harvard professor. He has written several books on soft power and smart power, this idea that we can do things that make us more attractive in the world, and being attractive to people actually helps us lead in international politics. And public diplomacy is quite related to that concept, but slightly different, because it's not just attracting, but actually performing certain duties that the government has committed itself to, like setting up these exchange programs or running programs for young leaders in different parts of the world, and doing all of these things that try to maximize the extent to which we are engaged with and involved with publics in the world. So it's not a passive sort of like, we do these things and then we're attractive and then we have positive impact on the world, but actually a very active doing. And the reason that I study not just US, but also Chinese public diplomacy is because different countries all around the world are doing this, and they're doing it in vastly different ways. And so it's important to me, when I was looking at the way the United States pursues relationship building with foreign publics, to think about what might be a contrasting model for how to engage in relationship building with publics. And China seems quite apt an example, especially right now.
Wow. Do you have any advice for students who may be interested or, exploring a PhD program?
So much advice. Let's see. I would distill it into some basic things. I think that it is valuable to have a postgraduate education in the field of international affairs. And so if that's a master's degree or an academic master's, a master's in public policy, a master's in public administration, those are all good. I think that there is value to getting a PhD, but I actually don't think that there's as much value as some people would expect if you want to be really engaged in policy work. So, for example, in my program, much of the program is dedicated to preparing scholars, to preparing people who are going to be professors. And there still is, especially at a lot of these the top programs, there tends to be a focus in political science on the fact that it is most valuable and it is most worthy of your time to pursue being an academic, being a professor, which means that there aren't a lot of resources for people who come into the programs, but instead want to consider careers in public service or careers in government or careers in policy or advocacy. And because those resources aren't there, that means that if you're looking for an advisor or something like that, often that advisor is going to be really well placed to tell you all the things you need to do. Publish in academic articles, which means this long, years-long process of doing research and then having it critiqued by the blind peer review process, and then trying to get it placed in top journals that aren't very useful to a policy career at all. And so I actually a top piece of advice that I often give to people who are considering doing a PhD is think about whether you actually have any interest in academia. And if you don't, sure, it'll sound good to call you doctor, but at the end of the day, it won't necessarily make all that much of a difference for you. Now, I say this with a healthy recognition that when I was a young person, the people that I was looking up to were people like Susan Rice, who's a Black woman who has a PhD and is heavily involved in the policy world. But I would still say that there are so many people who have gone very far without the PhD. It is a possibility. The other thing that I would say is that many people, including Susan Rice, who have gotten PhDs and then gone into policy, often do a shorter PhD program at a UK school. Like, she was a Rhodes Scholar, so she went to Oxford. You could go to Cambridge. You could go to a lot of excellent schools in the UK, get a doctorate, focus on something, write a master's or write a doctoral thesis, but be finished much faster than you would in the United States. And the reason for that is that US PhD programs, they require a lot of extra things that prepare you to be a professor. So they usually require you to be a graduate teaching assistant. They usually require you to, if not teach your own course. They usually require you to do years and years and years of very, very, very focused research with the aim of not just writing a thesis, but having really the first draft of an academic book or the first draft of a series of publishable peer-reviewed papers. In the UK, you're taking your seminars and then you're writing your thesis, but a lot of that extra stuff, like the teaching or having to think about publications, is pushed off until after you graduate, and that's why you finish faster in the UK. So those are some basic pieces of advice. I would say, on the longer term, if it is something that you want to pursue, if you're thinking that if you would like to get a PhD, it is a good idea to think about what you might want to focus on. And the way to be successful in academia is to focus on bringing some new perspective to academic writing on a certain topic. And so when I came into academia, I hadn't been reading academic papers for the past 5 years. I'd been in Egypt and China talking to people on the ground. And so I knew that I had an interest in public diplomacy, but I hadn't read academic research on the topic. And when I say academic research, I mean like going online, looking up academic publications through some sort of library account or something like that, and then reading what people who are published in peer-reviewed journals are writing on the topic. I had read think pieces, I had read national interest, I had read things like internet articles and op-eds and things like that. But what's going to prepare you for success in academia is reading academic journals and getting a feel for how people approach research in academic fields. I think I saw a question in the chat.
Yeah, so there are a few questions. The first one that we have here is from Jennifer, who asks, you talked a little bit on this earlier, but I'll still ask. And then the second part, I'm interested in hearing your response. The first part says, do cultural exchanges play a big role in public diplomacy? And then the second question is, what are some strategies in place to make organizations more culturally competent?
Good questions.
Yes.
Cultural exchanges play a large role in public diplomacy. The way that some people sort of think about what public diplomacy entails is often a mix of top leadership doing public events in foreign countries. So if you think about like a president going to a foreign country and having a forum where ordinary people can come and hear him or her give a speech, that would be an example of public diplomacy. Exchange programs, so cultural exchanges or other types of exchanges, academic exchanges, business exchanges, where people are able to engage with like-minded folks from the United States or like-minded folks from a different country. Cultural events that aren't necessarily exchanges. So when I say exchange, I usually mean something involving some travel, but cultural events might entail like having a 4th of July celebration at a U.S. embassy and inviting people, or like it doesn't just have to be sort of like national events. I remember one event that I did when I was in Egypt is we had during Black History Month, we had a soul food dinner for a group of kids, because that's American culture too. And that's why I think it's really important to have diversity in your representation abroad, because it diversifies the way that people think about the United States. So I was sitting there trying to think about how I could source some black-eyed peas, collard greens. Right.
Did they have it? Was it
and non-pork meat? I think we did fried chicken because we couldn't have pork. It was Egypt. It was a real adventure, but it was really fun to put that together. Eventually we found some frozen black-eyed peas.
Wow.
We found some collard greens. We got I think we got like fried chicken from some restaurant, and then I gave this restaurant, literally I had to give them a recipe, and I was like, okay, we were translating into Arabic, but it was like cornbread recipe. And then we also gave them a peach cobbler recipe.
Okay.
So yes, cultural programs are also a part of it, and then also there's an educational point. So to some extent, language learning and language activities can be a part of public diplomacy as well. On the second question of what organizations do to promote cultural competency, really depends on the organization, doesn't it? I mean, to some extent, I think that public diplomacy, just like everything else, is like what you make of it. And so if you have that diverse group of people who are representing and bringing their ideas to the table, then you're always going to have more cultural competence. You're always going to have a better representation of like the full spectrum of the culture.
Absolutely. And we've been finding that, different agencies and organizations right now in particular have been putting an extra emphasis and attempting to create a more culturally competent and a more diverse workplace. There's been recent reports that have been released, the GAO report and different things that points to where different federal agencies stand in terms of diversity. So there's definitely some opportunity there for both the agencies and organizations, as well as, individuals who can help, contribute to that mission there. So we have another question here from one of our former BPI board members, Ms. Chanel. Hi there, Chanel. She asks, what do you plan to do with your combined Ph.D. and diplomacy experience once you finish?
Man, your guess is as good as mine right now. And the reason I say that is because, unfortunately, it's a really difficult time for the academic job market. So I had always thought that I would actually pursue academia and try to become a professor in the most recent year. So I mentioned when I first left the State Department, I wanted to stay in the State Department. Once I realized that wasn't going to be a possibility, I thought, I'm going to go into this PhD program and see how it goes. And if it goes well, maybe I will consider academia. It seems like it's going pretty well. I do enjoy the ability to think deeply about, this topic. I was always go when I was in Egypt and China. I was always had something to do. Now, the thing that I'm supposed to be doing is producing interesting and like innovative ways of thinking about this topic. So I like that that is my job. My job is to use my brain. There are a lot of things that are really difficult about academia, and I'm happy to be pretty forthcoming with those as well. But I, for the past few years, to go on the academic job market sometime soon. But now college and universities are trying to decide if they're even going to be open next year.
Right.
Most colleges and universities have canceled their job searches for the next academic year, meaning that they're not hiring professors at all. And unfortunately, academia is a really, really tight job market already. It's the type of a place where there's a lot of competition for very, very few slots as professors, because you have professors who have lifelong careers and often now are staying in their jobs until 80, 85 years old, you know? So if you've already got your faculty of tenured professors, then why do you really need new people to come in and take those roles? Already a tough job market, now a lot tougher, because I think there was something like 200 or 300 schools who announced formally that they weren't going to be hiring next year. So we'll see how it goes the year after, I suppose. And that's what I'm thinking for the near term.
Great. Thank you for your answer. We have another question, and then I'll probably take maybe one or two more from the chats and then ask you a concluding question. So the next question is from one of our VPs for BPIA, VP for Education. She asked, what about graduate and professional programs like law, public administration? I know you mentioned, so maybe you could share more about the master's that you do have. And at what point in someone's career do you think that they need to pursue the master's based on kind of the direction that they're trying to go?
That's a great question. So I think that it is often when you go to DC or when you go to a place like in New York or something like that, and you're looking for a job in international affairs these days, minimum requirement is to have a master's degree, or they say 3 to 5 years of work experience, but honestly, a lot of people have both. I think that having a graduate education of some time is a very good idea. Now, whether that's a master's or a professional program or a law degree or a business degree is really up to you. And something that I often tell people is that the good thing I think about a career in public service is that there's no one right way to do it. Like if you want to be a lawyer, you really have to get a law degree. You have to go to law school.
Right.
If you want to be a professor, you have to get your Ph.D. in most cases. Some people with masters teach, but usually it's PhDs. But in policy, in public service, there's no necessary thing that you have to do. There are just a lot of good options. And so if you think that you could see yourself also being engaged in the private sector, then it might be worth getting a business, an MBA. If you think that you might see yourself practicing law, then it might be worth going to law school. A lot of people who don't practice law go to law school, and
Right.
I never went to law school. I don't think I would do well in law school because it doesn't seem fun to me. But there are plenty of people who work in policy who got law degrees and never actually practiced law or practiced law and transitioned. And so I actually don't have one thing that I think that people should do. One type of graduate degree that I think that people should pursue. I think that it really depends on where you're most comfortable and where you're most interested. Wherever you're most interested is where you're going to do well. I would say that in terms of thinking about when you should go to grad school, I always really liked the model of like finish undergrad, try and get a job doing something interesting for 2 years maybe, then go back to grad school, then think about getting a job that's really in your area of focus after grad school. It's funny though, because that's not what I did. I went to undergrad, then I went straight to grad school. But the reason that I did that is because the Pickering Fellowship required me to go directly from undergrad to grad school. The Pickering Fellowship doesn't do that anymore because now it's a graduate fellowship. So you apply for it at the same time as you're applying to grad school. And whenever that is, that's fine. But the particular iteration of the fellowship that I had just required that I go straight through.
Great, thank you. And then, so I don't want people to think that I'm skipping over their questions. 2 of them are kind of similar, so I'll let you better just more on how to connect with you offline or, email or LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm not doing a great job of looking at this chat, guys. So
Don't worry, I have
I'll
it
take
under
a
control. I
few.
have it under
Yeah.
control, Naima. So the last questions I'll take from the chat is from Daniel Evan White, who asks, can you talk about crafting your personal statement for your PhD applications and how you incorporated your practical experience into your academic interests to be most attractive to a program? And then there's a few people who kind of seconded that question too.
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, I will say first that my PhD application took a while to craft, and I recommend that when you are writing applications to any grad school that you have other people look at them. And so I think it's a good idea to always do
And
that.
could you say what type of professors or family member, who
Well, to
took
some
me?
extent, all of those people have a role to play, right? So
Right,
like I send things to my sister when I just want to say, like, does this make sense?
right, right.
But my sister is not is not in my field. My sister doesn't know anything about my field, so she wouldn't be the right person to go to tell me if this was the right type of an angle to take on the paper. So I would recommend for graduate programs maybe to have a student who's in the graduate program or in a similar graduate program to take a look at it. I don't think you necessarily have to have a professor look at it. If you have a professor that you're close with, then it's a good idea, but it's not like you need to go and find one. um, Grad students should also, or people who are thinking about going to grad school, I guess you should also think about, if you have the resources, if it's a possibility, you can try to visit the school. I found that with PhD programs, schools were extremely different in their policies. So a place like, I remember Princeton has on their website somewhere, if you are interested in coming and getting a PhD here, and maybe this has changed, so I don't want to say this particularly for this school, but some schools say, if you want to come and get a PhD here, don't try and speak to professors in our department before you get in, because a lot of people want to get a PhD here, basically is like, I
Yeah,
think what they're trying to say.
right.
So they don't have time to just reach out to individual people who might be interested and to say, like, hey, let me talk to you about this PhD program. That being the case, there were some PhD programs that I applied to where I reached out to professors who were in the program and I said, this is me, this is my background, this is my interest. So it wasn't just, hi, I'm interested, but a foreign service officer right now, I'm interested. I knew that I wanted to study public diplomacy even then.
Right.
I've read some of your work. It's always a good idea. Would you have any time to meet with me when I'm in Boston? I happen to be going on a trip to Boston that one time. Or, now Zoom is big, so would you have any time? It always doesn't hurt to try. Just don't be sensitive about it. If they don't write back to you, or if they say no, then maybe they have that policy, because sometimes that's what happens. And it happened to me. So always better to put yourself out there. In terms of how I wrote my application, I'm trying to think about the actual essay. I believe what I did is I started, and often, people just like the application thing to do is to start with something sort of like a poll, something that tells people about yourselves and then go more into the substance. What's really key to know about academic PhD programs is that they don't want you to just talk about why you're interested in a subject from a policy or sort of like an intellectual point of view. They want you to talk about it in terms of literature, published work on the topic. So
Yeah.
I think that in my essay, what I did is I said, something along the line of, you know, often when people think about diplomacy, they think about state-to-state relationships and elite-to-elite contact. And yet I've been working in a role for a couple of years in which I'm focused on people-to-government interactions. In Egypt, the revolution happened. It was really clear that people were important to this country. And then I moved to China, where people have very different levels of freedoms. And so it's always been interesting to me to think about how the US government as an actor might interact with different people around the world. Now I've like written that paragraph about what's interesting to me. How does that link into the academic literature that already exists on the topic? This is only for academic PhD programs. If you're thinking about a professional degree, like a master's in public policy, a master's in public administration, don't take this advice because it's very different. But for a PhD, then you want to go to your library catalog, get on the search engine, Google Scholar, whatever. And if you do Google Scholar, just be careful, because people are a little elitist in academic programs, and they're looking at the top journals, the most published, the most popular journals in the field. You can actually do a search on Google for like top journals in political science, top journals in communications, top journals in sociology to get a feel for this. But you want to be looking at the recent scholarship coming out of top journals that talked about this topic. Read the papers and then say, so for example, for me, I wanted to study public diplomacy. I didn't see a lot on the word public diplomacy, but I could say people are doing some really interesting work about public opinion, about international relations, and about foreign policy. A recent paper that was published by a professor in your department looked at the sentiment, levels of different types of sentiments that were expressed via Twitter, and then did a manual text analysis, or actually a structural text analysis, which is a computerized text analysis of, thousands of tweets, and determined that certain factors affect the atmosphere in the Middle East, such that Arabic tweets change, the actual cadence and the actual tenor of the conversation on Twitter changes according to world affairs. Now, I think that's interesting, because I think that I could build upon that by not just looking at how people are expressing themselves via Twitter, but how people are engaging in, government events, or how people are engaging with U.S. policymakers when they're making rounds on public diplomacy tours. And so you've got to be able to link what you're talking about to what already exists in academia. If you're applying to master's programs or some sort of a program that's a professional degree, you should be very clear about what you think your career goals will be, but it is not important at all to talk about the academic literature. You don't need to go and look up academic articles and read them. Rather, it's more important to spend time on talking about policy issues that excite you, or about maybe pieces for international affairs, pieces in foreign affairs, or the national interests that have piqued your interest. You don't have to cite the articles, but basically read those and then talk about the pressing issues that you think you could contribute to.
Great, Naima. Thank you so much for those perspectives. So my final question, and feel free to put any concluding thoughts on this. If you could speak to your younger self, is there anything that you would tell her that you wish you knew when you first started this career path?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. Before I forget, there's a question about how to connect with me. And I would say, if you want to connect with me, I am on LinkedIn. It's probably the best place to find me, to be completely honest. Though I apologize in advance. Alexandria knows this. I don't check it all that often. So it would be useful if you wrote in your message on LinkedIn that you were on this call, just so that I know that we have been in the same space, virtual space together before, if you reach out to me. Naima Green-Riley is my name. There's another Naima Green. There are several others apparently, but I have not yet met another Naima Green-Riley. Also, the other Naima Green is just a fantastic human being apparently, and she's doing some really great things in the world. Wow. She is an artist, she's a photographer, so if you ever see her, that's not me, but I'm really proud of her. She recently had a New York Times article.
Wow.
I mean, it's always great because I get tagged for her stuff as well, so right. I get tagged for my academic stuff, and then people think I'm a flourishing artist in Brooklyn. I'm not mad at it, but I'm Naima Green-Riley. And then on the topic of advice that I would give myself, I think that I always thought that I needed to do a bunch of things in order to get to the next step. So I tended to be like, I thought, oh well, if I want to go into academia, I've got to get this PhD, so I've got to plan that out and all these things. And then I thought that once I did sort of took the steps, then I'd just be well on the way. I thought there would be a clear path before me. What I found is that often there's not a clear path. So maybe if you want to be a particular type of lawyer, you can work at a particular firm, and then you know that you start off as like a certain type of associate, and then you work your way up, and the eventual path would be to be partner. Maybe there's a clear step in the corporate world if you're sort of climbing the ladder and getting higher in sort of the executive leadership eventually. Even in the State Department, there's a path, like it's like you come in, you're junior, you work your way up. If you work for 30 years, you might become an ambassador. My path was just never that linear, and I think I always wanted it to be, and then I realized that it wouldn't be. So I thought, oh, maybe I could stay in the State Department because there's a path here to get this PhD, but that didn't work out, right? And so that was a real kink in the road. And now I'm starting all over in this new path, which is academia, right? But to sometimes it's not common for people who are in PhD programs to also have engagement in the policy world, but I joined the board of Oxfam, I've had this opportunity to still speak into the policy world. What I've learned is that it's not linear, but sometimes it's better for it to not be linear. And so know that if you're the type of person who likes to have clarity, it can be a difficult thing to sort of walk outside of the path that has been set before you. And often I've had people tell me, like, what you need to be doing right now is you need to work really hard so you can get a good evaluation in the State Department and get promoted and go to the next level so you can post, blah, blah, blah. That's what you need to focus on. Or only thing you need to do right now is you have to write academic articles so that you can get a professor job and then, eventually get tenure and then become a full professor, and that's the way to go. When people give me that advice, I know that they give me that advice because that is true. You do need to do those things to get there. And so I don't scoff at it at all. And it is true that if I want to be a professor, I'm going to have to do those things. I'm going to have to jump through those hoops. And I'm going to have to spend time working to make myself well-rounded. I shouldn't say well-rounded, but well-practiced in that profession. But I think what I've realized is that doing that and staying true to my passions for other things, staying true to my passion for the policy world while I'm in academia is something that's going to always be most important to me because I know that that's my authentic self. And so having the courage to do that is something that I encourage you to do. And recognize that, it can be valuable to sometimes jump outside of the roles that people expect you to take on just because you're on a certain career path. The other side of that coin, though, is that I think for a long time I had just a really fun career, to be honest. Like, I went to Egypt, and even though, sometimes I was a little worried about the security situation, it was really cool to be there, to be able to work on these public diplomacy projects. It was really interesting to be in China. I got to travel a lot in Asia for the first time. I had a really great sort of like first few career moves, and I got to the PhD program, and it's hard. Like, it's really hard. And there are a lot of days when I would much rather do anything, like literally anything, than sit down at my computer and read 5 articles so that I can write 2 sentences. I am not exaggerating, in a paper that needs to be like 50 pages because I need to pay attention to literature and make sure that I'm writing about what has come before in this sort of academic trajectory for this topic. There's so many days when I just think, I want to be done with this. I want to be done with the PhD. I want to be at the next phase. Side of the coin of yes, go outside the beaten track or the beaten trail. The other side of it, though, is that sometimes there are not so fun parts of getting to the next step. But when I think about it, I think that even the people who seem like they're excelling quite easily, we live in the social media world where all your friends are like, you see like the top 30s out of under 30, the top 40s under 40. You see the people who are the entrepreneurs and who started this new thing and are viral and all this stuff. Even those people, have to work really hard for a long time, and people don't see that part before
Mm,
they get to that point.
that's right.
People who become lawyers struggle really hard to take this bar exam. A lot of people fail it and have to take it again. People who are entrepreneurs have to get money, have to get capital, have to be able to market themselves on a day-to-day basis. It always takes a little bit of work and a little bit of effort that can be really grueling and really hard to get to the next step. So that's something that I think that it was important for me to realize now, because there have been a lot of times in the PhD when I think, oh, this is really horrible. I'm really tired of this, and I don't know if I should continue if it makes me feel so bad.
Mm.
Sometimes the answer is you shouldn't continue. Sometimes you
Right,
really,
right.
you shouldn't. And hey, who knows? At some point, I think I'm going to get my PhD, but like at some point I might decide this is just like so not fun that I don't want to do it. But
Mm,
I think it's important to realize that a lot of things that are that lead you to a place where you are more distinguished, or where you have like a career where you are more well regarded, actually take a lot of work. And
right.
so sometimes you got to put it in.
Absolutely. Naima, thank you so much. One of the trailblazers. Okay, one of the BPIA 30 under 30. I'm assuming. Okay, maybe 40 under 40. Whichever applies. I won't give it away. But in any case,
No comment.
such an amazing journey and trajectory and experience, and just so much wisdom. I think that this was a very great, productive conversation. And I hope that to all the viewers, thank you all for joining today. So Naima, again, thank you so much for speaking to us and being a role model for us to see, to look up, because how you were looking at Susan Rice, there are going to be young people looking at you like that. And looking at you like that. I'm looking at you like that. So
Oh, well, thanks.
thank you again from BPIA for you coming to speak to us.
Real pleasure, and good luck to everybody. I mean, like, it's an individual journey for everyone. Look at the people who inspire you and see what they did. But if it doesn't work for you to do exactly what they did, do something else.
Yes, absolutely. All righty. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Again, thank you, Naima, for speaking to us. And I hope everyone
Absolutely.
has a nice night.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.